Sarah Martinez had always been good at blending in. Standing at 5 feet 6 inches with shoulder-length brown hair and wearing simple jeans and a navy blue sweater, she looked like any other mother spending a Saturday afternoon at Riverside Park with her 8-year-old son, Danny. The autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet as they walked toward the playground. Danny's excited chatter about his upcoming soccer game filling the crisp October air. What the other park visitors didn't know was that Sarah had spent the last 12 years serving her country as a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women to ever complete the grueling training program. She had been deployed to some of the most dangerous places on Earth, leading missions that required split-second decisions and unwavering courage. But today, she was just a mom, and that was exactly how she liked it. Sarah had retired from active duty 6 months ago after Danny's father, her husband Marcus, was killed in a car accident. The grief had been overwhelming, but Danny needed stability, and Sarah made the difficult decision to leave the military to focus on raising her son. They had moved to the quiet suburban town of Millbrook, where nobody knew about her military background. She preferred it that way. Danny ran ahead to the swings, his backpack bouncing as he hurried to claim his favorite spot. Sarah followed at a leisurely pace, enjoying the peaceful moment. The park was moderately busy for a weekend afternoon, with several families scattered across the large green space. She noticed a group of teenage boys near the basketball court, their voices carrying across the park as they played a pickup game. As Danny began swinging, Sarah sat on a nearby bench, keeping a watchful eye on her son while observing their surroundings. It was a habit she couldn't break from her military training. She automatically cataloged the exits, noted the positions of other people, and assessed potential threats. Even in this peaceful setting, her mind remained alert. The group of teenagers had finished their basketball game and were now walking in the general direction of the playground. Sarah counted 5 boys, probably between 16 and 18 years old. They were laughing loudly and pushing each other in the playful way teenagers do. She didn't think much of it until she noticed their attention had focused on an elderly man sitting alone on a bench about 50 yards away. The man appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair and a slight build. He was feeding pigeons from a small bag of breadcrumbs, completely absorbed in his peaceful activity. Sarah watched as the teenagers approached him, their body language shifting from playful to predatory. Her military training kicked in, and she felt her muscles tense. One of the boys, a tall kid with bleached hair and a basketball jersey, said something to the elderly man that Sarah couldn't quite hear. But she could see the man's reaction. He looked up nervously, shook his head, and tried to ignore them. The teenagers didn't back down. Instead, they formed a loose circle around the bench, effectively trapping the man. Sarah's jaw tightened. She had seen this kind of behavior before, both in civilian life and during her military service. These boys were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push someone they perceived as weak and defenseless. The elderly man was clearly becoming distressed, clutching his bag of breadcrumbs and looking around for help. Danny had moved from the swings to the monkey bars and was completely focused on his play. Sarah made a quick calculation. She could intervene without putting Danny at risk, but she needed to be careful not to escalate the situation unnecessarily. Maybe the boys would get bored and move on. But they didn't move on. Instead, the situation began to escalate. The bleached-haired boy knocked the bag of breadcrumbs from the elderly man's hands, sending the contents scattering across the ground. The pigeons scattered in a flurry of wings. Another teenager laughed and made a comment about the man being a crazy bird guy. The elderly man stood up, clearly trying to leave, but the boys blocked his path. Sarah had seen enough. She stood up from her bench and began walking toward the confrontation, her steps measured and purposeful. As she got closer, she could hear more of what the teenagers were saying. "Come on, old man. Don't you have any money for us?" the tall boy was saying, his voice mocking. "You can afford bird food, so you must have something. Please, just leave me alone," the elderly man replied, his voice shaking. "I don't want any trouble." "Oh, but trouble already found you," another boy chimed in, stepping closer to the man in an intimidating manner. Sarah was now close enough to intervene. She cleared her throat and spoke in a calm but firm voice. "Hey guys, why don't you leave him alone and find something else to do?" The teenagers turned to look at her, and She could see the calculation in their eyes. They were sizing her up, trying to determine if she posed any threat to their fun. The tall boy smirked and looked her up and down dismissively. "Mind your own business, lady," he said, his tone disrespectful. "This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does concern me," Sarah replied evenly. "This is a public park, and you're harassing someone. That makes it everyone's concern." The boys exchanged glances, and Sarah could see them making a group decision. Instead of backing down, they seemed to view her intervention as a challenge. The pack mentality was taking over, and she was now being perceived as another target. "Oh yeah," another boy said, "this one's shorter but stockier than the leader. And what are you going to do about it?" "Call our mommies." Sarah remained calm, but internally she was already running through defensive scenarios. She positioned herself between the teenagers and the elderly man, who took the opportunity to back away slightly. "I'm asking you nicely to leave this man alone and move on," she said. "That's all." The tall boy stepped closer to Sarah, trying to use his height to intimidate her. He was probably 6 feet tall and athletically built, clearly used to getting his way through physical presence. "Listen, soccer mom, why don't you go back to your kid and let us handle our business here?" At the mention of her son, Sarah's protective instincts sharpened. She glanced quickly toward the playground and saw that Danny was still safely playing, but she didn't like the fact that these boys had noticed him. Her priority was to de-escalate the situation and protect both the elderly man and her son. "There's no business to handle here," Sarah said firmly. "Just walk away, and everyone can continue enjoying their day at the park." But the teenagers were beyond listening to reason. The pack mentality had fully taken hold, and they saw Sarah's calm demeanor as a sign of weakness rather than strength. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The elderly man, sensing the tension escalating, tried to speak up. "Please, I'll just go. There's no need for anyone else to get involved." But as he tried to step around the group, one of the boys pushed him, causing him to stumble and nearly fall. That was the moment Sarah's military training fully engaged. The protective instinct she had honed over 12 years of service kicked in, and she stepped forward to steady the elderly man. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying a new edge of authority that made several of the boys hesitate. But the tall boy either didn't recognize the warning in her voice or didn't care. He saw her helping the elderly man and interpreted it as defiance of his authority. "I told you to mind your own business," he said, reaching out to grab Sarah's arm roughly. It was a mistake he would immediately regret. Sarah's response was swift and precise. She caught his wrist, applied a quick pressure point technique that made him gasp in pain, and used his own momentum to off-balance him. In seconds, the cocky teenager found himself on his knees, his arm controlled in a way that made any movement extremely painful. "Now you're going to listen to me," Sarah said calmly, maintaining the hold. "You're going to apologize to this gentleman, and then you're all going to leave. Right now." The other 4 boys stared in shock. Their leader, the one who had been so confident just moments before, was completely helpless in the grip of this seemingly ordinary woman. For a moment, it looked like they might actually comply. But teenagers, especially teenage boys in a group, don't like to back down from what they perceive as a challenge to their authority. Instead of recognizing that they were outmatched, they made the decision to escalate further. "Get her!" one of them shouted, and suddenly, Sarah found herself facing multiple attackers while trying to protect both the elderly man and maintain awareness of her son's location. What happened next would become a lesson these boys would never forget, and it would reveal to everyone present that they had made a serious error in judgment about who they were dealing with. The quiet woman at the park was about to show them exactly what 12 years as a Navy SEAL had taught her about handling threats. But as the boys moved to surround her, Sarah's greatest concern wasn't for her own safety. She could handle these teenagers without breaking a sweat. Her worry was for Danny, who was now watching from the playground, his 8-year-old eyes wide with fear as he saw his mother surrounded by what appeared to be a group of attackers. In that moment, Sarah Martinez wasn't just a former Navy SEAL facing a tactical situation. She was a mother whose child was watching, and that changed everything. The boys had no idea that their decision to escalate this confrontation would soon become the worst mistake of their young lives. As the teenagers closed in, Sarah's mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating angles, assessing threats, and planning her response. She had faced far more dangerous enemies than a group of teenage bullies, but never with her son watching. The stakes had never been higher, and the boys were about to learn exactly what that meant. The peaceful Saturday afternoon at Riverside Park was about to become a lesson in respect, consequences, and the dangerous assumption that appearances tell the whole story about a person. For Sarah Martinez, it was time to protect not just an innocent elderly man, but the safety and security of her own child. The real confrontation was just beginning. The first boy who rushed at Sarah was the stocky one who had made the comment about calling their mothers. He came at her with the wild, uncontrolled aggression of someone who had never faced real opposition. Sarah released her hold on the tall boy's wrist and pivoted smoothly to her right, using the attacker's momentum against him. A simple hip toss sent him tumbling across the grass, where he landed hard and stayed down, the wind knocked out of him. The tall boy, freed from her grip, tried to regain his authority by grabbing Sarah from behind. It was another tactical error. Sarah dropped her center of gravity, drove her elbow back into his solar plexus, and when he bent forward in pain, she grabbed his shoulders and brought her knee up toward his face. She pulled the strike at the last second, stopping just short of contact. But the message was clear. He stumbled backward, clutching his stomach and gasping for air. 2 down, 3 to go. But these weren't the kind of precise, calculated movements Sarah would use in a real combat situation. She was holding back significantly, using just enough force to neutralize the threats without causing serious injury. These were still kids, even if they were making very poor decisions. The remaining 3 boys had spread out in an attempt to surround her, but they were doing it all wrong. Their positioning was amateur, leaving gaps she could exploit and preventing them from supporting each other effectively. Sarah kept the elderly man behind her and maintained visual contact with Danny, who was standing frozen by the monkey bars, his small hands gripping the metal bars as he watched his mother face multiple attackers. "Danny, stay where you are," Sarah called out firmly, but calmly. She needed him to stay in place where she could see him and where he would be safe from the confrontation. The last thing she wanted was for him to try to help and put himself in danger. One of the remaining boys, a redhead with freckles who looked younger than the others, seemed to be having second thoughts. "Maybe we should just go," he said nervously, looking around at his friends who were already down. "This is getting out of hand." But the other 2 weren't ready to admit defeat. The leader was back on his feet, though still struggling to breathe normally. His pride was wounded more than his body, and that made him dangerous in an unpredictable way. "She just got lucky," he wheezed. "It's 5 against 1. We can take her." Except it wasn't 5 against 1 anymore. 2 of his friends were out of the fight, one curled up on the grass holding his stomach, the other sitting up, but showing no interest in rejoining the conflict. The red-headed boy was backing away. That left just 2 who were still willing to fight. Sarah tried one more time to de-escalate. "This is your last chance to walk away," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had commanded respect from hardened soldiers in combat zones. "No one has to get hurt here. You can all go home and tell your friends you learned something today." The elderly man, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Young lady, should I call the police?" He had his phone in his hand and was clearly shaken by what he was witnessing. "Not yet," Sarah replied without taking her eyes off the remaining threats. "Let's see if these boys are smart enough to make the right choice." But the tall boy's pride wouldn't let him back down, especially not in front of his friends and with other park visitors now starting to watch. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, including several parents who were calling their own children away from the playground area. "Come on, Jake," the tall boy said to his remaining ally, a dark-haired kid who looked like he played football. "She's just one woman. We rush her together, we can take her down." Jake looked uncertain, but peer pressure and teenage bravado won out over common sense. He nodded reluctantly. "Okay, but after this, we're done." "This is crazy." Sarah sighed inwardly. She had hoped they would choose differently, but she had been in enough conflicts to recognize when diplomacy had reached its limits. Sometimes people had to learn lessons the hard way. The 2 boys coordinated their attack better than their predecessors had. The tall boy came at her from the front, while Jake tried to flank her from the left. It was a sound strategy in theory, but They were executing it against someone who had been trained to handle multiple attackers in life-or-death situations. Sarah waited until the last possible moment, then dropped into a low crouch and swept the tall boy's legs out from under him. As he fell, she spun toward Jake, who was committed to his attack and couldn't change direction. She caught his wrist, stepped through his momentum, and used a classic judo throw to send him flying over her shoulder. He landed hard but safely on the grass behind her. The tall boy tried to get up quickly, but Sarah was already there. She placed her foot lightly on his chest and looked down at him with calm eyes. "Stay down," she said simply. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. Something in her voice and posture finally got through to him that he was dealing with someone far beyond his ability to handle. The confrontation was over. All 5 boys were on the ground in various states of defeat and confusion. The 2 who had been taken down first were sitting up now, no longer interested in fighting. The redhead had backed away about 20 feet and was standing with his hands up in a gesture of surrender. Jake was lying on his back staring up at the sky, probably wondering how he had ended up there so quickly. And their leader was flat on his back with a woman's foot on his chest, finally, understanding that his assumptions about her had been completely wrong. Sarah looked around at the boys with an expression that was more disappointed than angry. "Does anyone want to explain to me why you thought it was acceptable to harass an elderly man who was just feeding pigeons?" Silence. The boys were still processing what had just happened to them. A woman they had dismissed as a soccer mom had just taken apart their entire group without even breathing hard. None of them had an answer that didn't make them sound like the bullies they had been. "Stand up," Sarah said, stepping back from the tall boy. "All of you." One by one, they got to their feet, some moving more slowly than others. She looked each of them in the eye. "What's your name?" she asked the tall boy. "Tyler," he mumbled, not meeting her gaze. "Tyler, I want you to think about something. That gentleman you were harassing? He could be someone's grandfather, someone's father. Maybe he lost his wife recently, and feeding the pigeons is one of the few things that brings him peace. Did you ever think about that?" Tyler shifted uncomfortably, but didn't answer. Sarah continued. "You saw someone you thought was weaker than you, and instead of showing respect or kindness, you decided to make his day worse." "What? We were just messing around," one of the other boys said defensively. "Messing around?" Sarah's voice carried an edge of steel. "You surrounded him, knocked his belongings out of his hands, blocked his path, and demanded money from him. That's not messing around. That's robbery and assault." The boys exchanged nervous glances. When she put it that way, their actions sounded much more serious than they had thought. "Now," Sarah continued, "you're going to apologize to this gentleman. Each of you, individually and sincerely. Then, you're going to pick up every piece of bread you scattered and put it back in his bag. And then, you're going to leave this park and think seriously about the kind of people you want to be." The elderly man had been watching the entire exchange with amazement. When Sarah turned to him, he shook his head slowly. "Young lady, I've never seen anything like that. Are you a police officer?" "Something like that," Sarah replied with a small smile. She wasn't ready to reveal her military background to a group of teenagers who might spread the story around town. She preferred her privacy. One by one, the boys approached the elderly man and offered awkward but genuine apologies. The experience of being so thoroughly outclassed by someone they had underestimated seemed to have shocked them into a more mature perspective. They gathered up the scattered breadcrumbs as instructed, some of them actually looking ashamed of their behavior. As the boys prepared to leave, Tyler approached Sarah one more time. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. We didn't realize." "You didn't realize what?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "We didn't realize you could do what you did. We thought you were just a regular mom." Sarah considered this for a moment. "Tyler, I am a regular mom. But being a mom doesn't mean being helpless. And being young and strong doesn't give you the right to pick on people who can't defend themselves. The measure of a person isn't how tough they are against someone weaker. It's how they treat people who need help." Tyler nodded slowly, processing her words. "Yes, ma'am. I understand." As the group of boys walked away, several of them looking back over their shoulders in continued amazement, Sarah finally allowed herself to check on Danny. Her son had remained by the playground equipment throughout the confrontation, following her instruction to stay put. But now he was running toward her, his 8-year-old face a mixture of awe, confusion, and pride. "Mom," Danny called as he reached her. "That was amazing. How did you do that? Where did you learn to fight like that?" Sarah knelt down to his level and put her hands on his shoulders. "Are you okay? Were you scared?" Danny thought about it seriously before answering. "A little bit. But I knew you would win. You're the strongest person I know." The elderly man approached them, having retrieved his refilled bag of breadcrumbs. "Young man, your mother is quite remarkable. You should be very proud of her." "I am," Danny said with conviction. "But, Mom, you never told me you could do that. Are you like a superhero or something?" Sarah laughed, the tension of the confrontation finally leaving her body. "No, honey, I'm not a superhero. I'm just your mom. But I did have some special training before you were born that taught me how to protect people." "What kind of training?" Danny asked, his curiosity evident. Sarah looked into her son's eyes and realized this was a conversation they would need to have eventually. Danny was getting older, and he deserved to know more about his mother's background. But this wasn't the time or place for that discussion. "We'll talk about it at home, okay?" she said. "Right now, let's make sure our friend here is all right." She turned to the elderly man. "Are you hurt at all? Do you need us to take you somewhere?" The man waved off her concern. "I'm fine, thanks to you. But I have to ask, what exactly was that training you mentioned? I've never seen anyone handle multiple attackers like that, especially not someone who looked so, well, normal." Sarah smiled at his choice of words. "I spent some time in the military. They taught me a few things about taking care of myself." It was a massive understatement, but it was all she was willing to share with strangers. The elderly man seemed to sense there was much more to the story, but he was polite enough not to press for details. As they prepared to leave the area, Sarah noticed that the crowd of onlookers who had gathered during the confrontation was starting to disperse. Most of them were looking at her with expressions of curiosity and respect. She had a feeling that word of what had happened would spread quickly through the small town. The thought made her slightly uncomfortable. Sarah had chosen Millbrook specifically because it was quiet and anonymous. The last thing she wanted was to become local celebrity or to have people constantly asking questions about her background. But she had acted to protect an innocent person and her son, and she couldn't regret that choice. As they walked back toward their car, Danny chattering excitedly about what he had witnessed, Sarah reflected on the afternoon's events. In many ways, the confrontation had been completely routine for someone with her training. 5 untrained teenagers posed no real threat to her abilities. But the emotional stakes had been higher than anything she had faced in military service because her son had been watching. Danny's safety had been her primary concern throughout the confrontation, but there had been another layer to her thinking. She wanted her son to see that standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves was the right thing to do, even when it was difficult or dangerous. She hoped the lesson he took from today's events was about courage, compassion, and doing what was right, not just about physical prowess. As they reached their car, Sarah took one last look back at the park. The elderly man was sitting peacefully on his bench again, feeding the pigeons that had returned now that the disturbance was over. The playground was full of children again, their parents keeping a closer eye on the surroundings than they had before. Everything had returned to normal, but Sarah knew that her quiet anonymity in Millbrook had probably ended today. Word would spread about the woman who had single-handedly handled 5 teenage attackers without breaking a sweat. People would ask questions. Some would want to know her background, her training, her story. She would deal with that when it came. For now, she was content to be Danny's mom, driving home after an eventful day at the park, ready to answer his questions about her past and help him process what he had witnessed. The confrontation was over, but the conversation with her son was just beginning, and, in many ways, that was the more challenging task ahead. The drive home was filled with Danny's endless questions. He sat in the back seat, his seatbelt on, leaning forward as much as the safety restraint would allow, his 8-year-old mind racing with excitement and curiosity about what he had just witnessed. "Mom, when you grabbed that big kid's arm, how did you make him fall down so fast? And when the other one tried to grab you, you moved like you could see him coming before he even got there. Are you like a ninja?" Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror at her son's animated face. She had known this conversation was inevitable ever since she decided to intervene at the park, but she hadn't expected it to be quite so immediate or intense. Danny had always been a bright, observant child, and what he had seen today had clearly made a huge impression on him. "I'm not a ninja, sweetie," Sarah said with a smile. "But remember how I told you I was in the military before you were born? Well, they taught me how to defend myself and other people. It's part of keeping everyone safe. But Dad was in the military too, and he never moved like that," Danny pointed out. Marcus had been a logistics officer in the Army, responsible for coordinating supplies and equipment. His job had been important, but hadn't involved combat training. "Different people in the military have different jobs," Sarah explained carefully. "Your dad's job was to make sure soldiers had everything they needed to do their jobs. My job was different. I had to learn different skills." Danny was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then, he asked the question Sarah had been dreading. "What was your job exactly? And why didn't you ever tell me about it before?" Sarah pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine. Their house was a modest two-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood, with a small front yard and a larger backyard where Danny could play safely. It was the kind of normal, suburban home that Sarah had dreamed of during her years of deployment, when she was sleeping in barracks or tents in foreign countries. "Come on, let's go inside, and I'll make us some hot chocolate," Sarah said. "Then, we can talk about this properly." As they walked up the front steps, Sarah's mind was racing. She had always planned to tell Danny about her military service eventually, but she had imagined having that conversation when he was older, maybe in his teens when he could better understand the complexities of her career and the reasons she had left it. Today's events had accelerated that timeline considerably. Inside the house, Sarah went through the familiar routine of making hot chocolate while Danny sat at the kitchen table, his chin resting on his hands, watching her every move. She could feel his eyes on her, and she knew he was seeing her differently now than he had that morning. The mom who made him breakfast and helped with homework had been revealed to have capabilities he never suspected. "Okay," Sarah said, setting 2 mugs of hot chocolate on the table and sitting down across from her son. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Danny said immediately. "I want to know what you did in the military, and where you learned to fight like that, and why those boys couldn't even touch you, and why you never told me about any of it before." Sarah took a sip of her hot chocolate, buying herself a moment to think about where to begin. "Well, I was in the Navy for 12 years, from before you were born until just 6 months ago. I was part of a special group called the Navy SEALs." Danny's eyes widened. Even at 8 years old, he had heard enough movies and television references to know that Navy SEALs were considered elite soldiers. "Really? Like the guys in the movies who go on secret missions?" "Something like that," Sarah said, "though the movies usually get a lot of things wrong. But, yes, we did go on missions that most people don't know about. We trained really hard to be able to protect our country and help people who were in danger." "Is that where you learned to fight like you did today?" "That's part of it. SEALs have to learn how to defend themselves and others in all kinds of situations. We study martial arts, we learn about tactics and strategy, and we practice until those skills become automatic." "But, Danny, the most important thing I learned wasn't how to fight. It was when to fight and when not to fight." Danny looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Sarah leaned forward, wanting to make sure her son understood this crucial point. "Fighting should always be the last choice, never the first. Today at the park, I tried to get those boys to leave the elderly man alone just by talking to them. I gave them several chances to walk away before anything physical happened. I only used force when they wouldn't listen and when they became a danger to innocent people." "But you weren't scared of them at all," Danny observed. "Even when there were 5 of them, and only 1 of you. I was concerned about keeping you and that gentleman safe," Sarah corrected. "I'm always careful, and I'm always aware of what's happening around me. But you're right that I wasn't scared of those particular boys. My training gave me the confidence to handle that situation." Danny was quiet for a moment, stirring his hot chocolate thoughtfully. Then he asked, "Why did you stop being a SEAL? Did you get tired of it?" This was the hardest question, and Sarah felt her throat tighten slightly. "I stopped because Daddy died, and I realized that being your mom was more important to me than anything else. I wanted to be here with you, to help you grow up, and to make sure you felt safe and loved. But you could have kept being a SEAL and still been my mom, right? Other military people have kids." "Yes, they do," Sarah agreed. "And for a long time, I managed to do both. But SEAL missions require you to be away from home for long periods, sometimes in places where you can't even call or send letters. After Daddy died, I didn't want to take the chance of leaving you alone if something happened to me too. You're more important than any mission. Danny reached across the table and took his mother's hand. I'm glad you came home, and I'm glad you were there today to help that man. Sarah squeezed his hand gently. Me too, sweetheart. That's what we do for people who need help. We stand up for them, even when it's hard or scary. As they finished their hot chocolate, Sarah noticed that Danny seemed to be processing everything she had told him. She could see the wheels turning in his 8-year-old brain as he tried to reconcile this new information with everything he had thought he knew about his mother. The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Sarah glanced at the clock and realized it was only about an hour since they had left the park. She wasn't expecting anyone, and unexpected visitors always made her slightly alert, a habit left over from her military service. Through the front window, she could see a police car parked in her driveway. Sarah sighed inwardly. She had hoped to avoid this complication, but she should have known that a confrontation involving 5 teenagers at a public park would eventually attract official attention. Stay here and finish your hot chocolate, Sarah told Danny. I need to answer the door. She opened the front door to find Officer Patricia Hernandez, a woman in her mid-30s wearing the uniform of the Millbrook Police Department. Sarah had never met her before, but she seemed professional and approachable. Ms. Martinez? I'm Officer Hernandez. I was hoping I could speak with you about an incident at Riverside Park earlier this afternoon. Of course, Sarah said. Would you like to come in? Officer Hernandez accepted the invitation and followed Sarah into the living room. Danny appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, curious about the visitor, but Sarah gestured for him to stay back. I've been getting reports about some kind of altercation at the park, Officer Hernandez began. Several witnesses mentioned that you were involved in subduing multiple attackers. I wanted to get your side of the story. Sarah nodded. 5 teenage boys were harassing an elderly man. They had him surrounded and were demanding money from him. I intervened and asked them to leave him alone. When they refused and became aggressive toward both me and the elderly gentleman, I defended us. According to witnesses, you handled all 5 boys by yourself without sustaining any injuries. That's pretty remarkable. Do you have some kind of martial arts background? I have some training, yes, Sarah said carefully. I served in the military for 12 years before retiring 6 months ago. Officer Hernandez was taking notes, but Sarah could see her evaluating this information. What branch and what was your role? Sarah hesitated for a moment. She had hoped to keep her specific background private, but she realized that lying to a police officer during an official investigation would only create bigger problems. I was a Navy SEAL. The officer's pen stopped moving, and she looked up at Sarah with new interest. A Navy SEAL? I didn't realize women could be SEALs. It's a recent development, Sarah said. I was part of the first group of women to complete the training program. Officer Hernandez whistled softly. That explains a lot. The witnesses said it looked like you barely broke a sweat taking down 5 attackers. They said it was like watching a movie. Those boys weren't really trained fighters, Sarah said. They were just teenagers who thought they could intimidate people with numbers and size. Once they realized they were outmatched, they calmed down pretty quickly. Were any of them injured? Nothing serious. Some bruised egos, and maybe some sore muscles tomorrow. But I was careful not to cause any real damage. They're kids, even if they were making poor choices. Officer Hernandez continued taking notes. The elderly gentleman you helped, Mr. Rodriguez, called to report the incident. He was very complimentary about your intervention. He said you probably saved him from being robbed or worse. I just did what anyone should do when they see someone being bullied, Sarah said. Well, not anyone could have done what you did. Officer Hernandez replied with a smile. But I appreciate the sentiment. Now, I do need to ask about the boys involved. Do you know any of their names? One of them said his name was Tyler. That's all I got. They were all probably between 16 and 18 years old. The leader was tall, maybe 6 feet, with bleached blonde hair. He was wearing a basketball jersey. Officer Hernandez wrote down the description. I'll check with the school resource officers. In a town this size, they probably know exactly who you're describing. Were they apologetic afterward? Yes, actually. Once they realized they had misjudged the situation, they all apologized to Mr. Rodriguez and helped clean up the mess they had made. I think they learned something from the experience. That's good to hear. Look, Ms. Martinez, technically you were defending yourself and another person from assault and possible robbery. Everything you did was legally justified. But I have to ask, are you planning to press charges against any of the boys? Sarah considered this question carefully. On one hand, the boys had committed crimes and could have seriously traumatized or injured Mr. Rodriguez if she hadn't intervened. On the other hand, they were young, and they had seemed genuinely remorseful once they understood the consequences of their actions. I'd prefer to leave that up to Mr. Rodriguez, Sarah said finally. If he wants to press charges, I'll support whatever decision he makes. But, personally, I think they learned their lesson today. Sometimes experiencing consequences is more effective than legal punishment, especially for kids that age. Officer Hernandez nodded approvingly. I think that's a wise approach. Mr. Rodriguez expressed similar sentiments when I spoke with him. He was more impressed with your intervention than angry about the boy's behavior. As the officer prepared to leave, she turned back to Sarah with a curious expression. Can I ask you a personal question? What's it like being a Navy SEAL? And what brought you to Millbrook? Sarah glanced toward the kitchen where Danny was still sitting, and Officer Hernandez seemed to understand. I wanted to give my son a normal, quiet life, Sarah said. After my husband died, I realized that family was more important to me than my career. Millbrook seemed like the perfect place to raise a child. Well, I hope today's incident doesn't change that for you, Officer Hernandez said. Though I have a feeling word is going to spread pretty quickly about what happened. In a small town like this, a story like yours is going to be talked about for quite a while. After the officer left, Sarah returned to the kitchen where Danny was waiting with barely contained excitement. Was that about what happened at the park? Are you in trouble? No, sweetie, I'm not in trouble. The police officer just wanted to make sure everyone was okay and to get the facts about what happened. And you told her you were a Navy SEAL? I had to. Police officers need to know the truth when they're investigating something. Danny grinned. This is so cool. My mom is a real Navy SEAL. Wait until I tell everyone at school. Sarah felt a flash of concern. Danny, let's talk about that. I know you're excited about this, but I'd prefer if we kept the details about my military service private. Can you do that for me? Danny's face fell slightly. Why? Aren't you proud of what you did? I'm very proud of my service, Sarah said. But sometimes it's better to keep certain things private. People might treat us differently if they know, and I chose to move here because I wanted us to have a normal life. Do you understand? Danny nodded, though he still looked disappointed that he couldn't share his mother's secret with his friends. I understand. But, Mom, what you did today was really amazing. Those boys were bigger and stronger than you, but you handled them like it was easy. It looked easy because I've practiced those skills for so many years that they've become automatic, Sarah explained. But, Danny, the most important thing about today wasn't that I could defend myself. It was that I chose to help someone who needed it. That's the lesson I want you to remember. As evening approached, and they went through their normal routine of dinner, homework, and bedtime stories, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in just one afternoon. Her carefully maintained anonymity was probably over. By tomorrow, everyone in Millbrook would know that the quiet woman who had moved to town 6 months ago was actually a former Navy SEAL. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. On one hand, she valued her privacy and had hoped to blend into the community without attracting attention. On the other hand, she was proud of her service and had nothing to be ashamed of. Maybe it was time to stop hiding who she was. As she tucked Danny into bed that night, he looked up at her with admiration shining in his eyes. Mom, I know you said to keep it private, but I just want you to know that I think you're the bravest person in the world. And I'm really glad you're my mom. Sarah kissed his forehead and smiled. I'm glad I'm your mom too, Danny. Sweet dreams. As she turned off his bedroom light and closed the door, Sarah realized that regardless of what happened next, today had been a turning point for both of them. Danny now knew more about who his mother really was, and Sarah had been reminded that sometimes you can't hide from your past or your true nature. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as word spread through the community about the events at Riverside Park. But tonight, Sarah was content to be exactly what she had always been, a mother who would do anything to protect those she loved and those who couldn't protect themselves. The quiet life she had sought in Millbrook was about to become much more complicated, but maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. After all, hiding her true self had never really been sustainable in the long term. Perhaps it was time to find out what it would be like to live as both a Navy SEAL and a small-town mom, without trying to keep those two parts of her identity separate. Sarah's prediction about word spreading quickly proved to be remarkably accurate. By Monday morning, it seemed like half of Millbrook had heard some version of the story about what had happened at Riverside Park. As Sarah walked Danny to school, she noticed people looking at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright awe. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 houses down and had barely acknowledged Sarah's existence in the 6 months since they'd moved to town, was suddenly very interested in having a conversation. "Sarah, dear, I heard about your heroic actions at the park this weekend," Mrs. Patterson said, intercepting them at the corner. "Is it really true that you're some kind of special forces soldier?" "I served in the Navy," Sarah replied diplomatically, not wanting to get into specifics with someone who was clearly fishing for gossip material. "But not just regular Navy," Mrs. Patterson pressed. "My nephew heard from his friend whose sister works at the police station that you're a Navy SEAL." "I didn't even know women could be Navy SEALs." Danny looked up at his mother expectantly, waiting to see how she would handle this interrogation. Sarah had coached him the night before about keeping their conversation private, but she realized that trying to deny her background now would be futile. "It's a relatively recent development," Sarah said carefully. "But, yes, I was a SEAL before I retired to focus on raising Danny." Mrs. Patterson's eyes lit up with the excitement of someone who had just confirmed a piece of premium neighborhood gossip. "How fascinating. And you just moved here to be a regular suburban mom? That must be quite an adjustment." "Not really," Sarah said firmly. "Being Danny's mom has always been my most important job. Everything else was just career." As they continued walking toward the school, Danny whispered, "She's going to tell everyone, isn't she?" "Probably," Sarah admitted. "But that's okay. We don't have anything to hide." At the school, Sarah's anonymity disintegrated further. Other parents who had previously offered polite but distant greetings now approached her with open curiosity and admiration. "Sarah, I heard about what you did at the park," said Jennifer Walsh, whose daughter Emma was in Danny's class. "That was incredible. Those boys could have really hurt Mr. Rodriguez." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Sarah replied, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. Most people would have called for help or tried to find security rather than intervening directly. "Not anyone could have handled 5 attackers without getting hurt," Jennifer pointed out. "Emma came home asking if I knew any martial arts because she heard Danny's mom was like a real-life superhero." Sarah winced slightly at the superhero comparison. "I'm really not. I just had some training that came in handy." As they reached Danny's classroom, his teacher, Mrs. Chun, approached them. "Danny has been telling me about your interesting weekend," she said with a warm smile. "I understand you have quite an impressive background." "Danny, why don't you go put your backpack away?" Sarah suggested, wanting to have this conversation without her son listening. Once Danny was out of earshot, Mrs. Chun continued, "I hope you don't mind him sharing. He's clearly very proud of you, and, honestly, after hearing about what happened, I am too. It takes real courage to step in when someone needs help." "I appreciate that," Sarah said. "I just hope this doesn't turn into too big of a distraction. Danny's adjusting well here, and I'd hate for this to complicate things for him." "I don't think it will be a problem," Mrs. Chin assured her. "If anything, the other children seem impressed that their classmate's mom is so capable. And between you and me, having someone with your background in our community feels reassuring." As Sarah walked home alone, she reflected on how different this morning had been from previous school drop-offs. For 6 months, she had been just another single mom in the neighborhood. Now she was the former Navy SEAL who had single-handedly taken down 5 teenage attackers. The anonymity she had valued was gone, but perhaps that wasn't entirely negative. Her phone rang as she approached her house. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Ms. Martinez? This is Principal Williams from Millbrook High School. I was wondering if I could speak with you about an incident involving some of our students this weekend." Sarah had been expecting this call. "Of course, Principal Williams. I assume this is about what happened at Riverside Park." "Yes, it is. I've identified the 5 boys involved, and I've spoken with their parents. They're all good kids who made some very poor choices. I understand you handled the situation with remarkable restraint." "They're young," Sarah said. "Young people sometimes do stupid things. What matters is whether they learn from the experience. That's exactly the attitude I was hoping you'd have, Principal Williams said, relief evident in his voice. I was wondering if you might be willing to speak with them. Not in any kind of punitive way, but perhaps to help them understand the broader implications of their actions. Sarah considered this request carefully. What did you have in mind? Well, I've learned about your military background, and I think it might be powerful for them to hear from someone who has dedicated their life to protecting others. Someone who chose service over selfishness. Would you be willing to meet with them? Let me think about it and get back to you, Sarah said. I want to talk to my son first and make sure he's comfortable with me getting more involved in this situation. After hanging up, Sarah realized that her hope of maintaining a low profile was becoming less realistic by the hour. But maybe that was okay. Maybe Millbrook could benefit from having someone with her background as an active member of the community. The afternoon brought another unexpected visitor. Sarah was working in her garden when a car pulled into her driveway. A woman in her 50s got out, followed by a teenage boy who looked familiar. It was Tyler, the tall boy who had been the ringleader of the group at the park. The woman approached nervously. Ms. Martinez? I'm Karen Stevens, Tyler's mother. I was hoping we could talk. Sarah stood up, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves. Of course. Would you like to come inside? Actually, Tyler has something he wants to say to you first, Karen said, placing a hand on her son's shoulder. Tyler looked significantly less confident than he had at the park. In fact, he looked like he hadn't slept much since Saturday. Ms. Martinez, I wanted to apologize again for what happened. Not just for bothering that old man, but for the way we talked to you and for trying to, well, for what we tried to do. I appreciate the apology, Tyler, Sarah said. But I'm more interested in whether you understand why what you did was wrong. Tyler nodded earnestly. My mom made me think about how I'd feel if someone treated my grandfather that way. And she told me that if you hadn't been there to stop us, we could have gotten in real legal trouble. We could have been charged with robbery or assault. That's right, Sarah confirmed. But, more importantly, you could have really frightened or hurt an innocent person who was just trying to enjoy his day peacefully. I know, Tyler said, looking genuinely ashamed. We weren't thinking about that. We were just showing off, I guess. Being stupid. Karen Stevens spoke up. Tyler spent all weekend researching Navy SEALs online. When he realized what you were capable of and how much you held back to avoid hurting him and his friends, it really opened his eyes. You could have really hurt us, couldn't you? Tyler asked. But you didn't. I used the minimum force necessary to protect Mr. Rodriguez, and in the confrontation, Sarah explained. Violence should always be the last option, and when it is necessary, you should never use more than the situation requires. Tyler was quiet for a moment, then asked, how do I make sure I never do anything that's stupid again? It was a thoughtful question, and Sarah could see that the boy was genuinely trying to learn from his mistake. Think before you act. Ask yourself how your actions will affect other people. And remember that real strength isn't about intimidating people who are weaker than you. Real strength is about protecting people who need help. As the Stevens family prepared to leave, Karen turned back to Sarah. Thank you for handling this the way you did. Tyler could have been seriously hurt if you had responded with full force, and honestly, after what he did, I'm not sure he would have deserved better. But you showed restraint and gave him a chance to learn. Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow, Sarah replied. Tyler's a good kid who made a bad choice. That doesn't define who he has to be. After they left, Sarah realized that this was probably how her life in Millbrook was going to be from now on. People would know about her background. They would seek her out for advice or help. And she would need to decide how much of herself she was willing to share with her new community. That evening, as she and Danny were having dinner, he brought up something that had been on his mind all day. Mom, some kids at school said their parents think you should train people to defend themselves. Like teach a class or something. Would you ever do that? Sarah paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. What do you think about that idea? I think it would be cool, Danny said enthusiastically. You could teach people to protect themselves and help others, like you did at the park. It would mean that more people would know about my background, Sarah pointed out. And it might mean that our quiet life here becomes less quiet. Danny considered this seriously. But, Mom, isn't it better to help people than to hide? You always tell me that we should use our talents to make things better for other people. Out of the mouths of babes. Sarah realized that her 8-year-old son had just articulated something she had been struggling with since Saturday. She had been so focused on creating a normal life for Danny that she had perhaps been selfish with her abilities and experience. You know what, Danny? You're absolutely right. Maybe it is time to stop hiding and start helping. The next morning, Sarah called Principal Williams back and agreed to speak with the 5 boys involved in the park incident. She also started researching what it would take to offer basic self-defense classes in Millbrook. If her anonymity was gone anyway, she might as well make the best of it. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing in the high school gymnasium facing Tyler and his 4 friends. They sat in folding chairs arranged in a semicircle, their body language reflecting a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. "I'm not here to lecture you," Sarah began. "I'm here to help you understand something important about strength, respect, and responsibility." Over the next hour, she talked with them about the difference between power and strength, about the responsibility that comes with physical ability, and about the importance of standing up for people who can't defend themselves. She told them about missions where she had risked her life to protect innocent people, and about the satisfaction that comes from using your abilities to help rather than intimidate. By the end of the session, all 5 boys had committed to participating in a peer mentoring program at the school, where they would work with younger students who were being bullied. "You made a mistake," Sarah told them as the session ended. "But that mistake doesn't define you. What defines you is what you choose to do next." 3 months later, Sarah was teaching self-defense classes twice a week at the community center. Her students ranged from teenage girls who wanted to feel safer walking alone to elderly residents who wanted to maintain their independence. She also volunteered with the police department, helping to train officers in de-escalation techniques and non-lethal force options. Danny thrived in this new environment where his mother's abilities were seen as an asset rather than something to hide. He was proud to tell his friends that his mom was helping to make their community safer, and he often attended her classes to practice basic techniques. One evening, as they walked home from the community center after a particularly successful class, Danny looked up at his mother with satisfaction. "Mom, I'm glad you stopped hiding who you really are. You're helping so many people now." Sarah smiled and put her arm around her son's shoulders. "You know what, Danny? I'm glad too. It turns out that being yourself is much easier than pretending to be someone else." The quiet life she had originally sought in Millbrook had evolved into something richer and more meaningful. She was still Danny's mom first and foremost, but now she was also a valued member of the community who used her unique skills and experience to help others. The confrontation at Riverside Park had been the catalyst for this change, forcing her to choose between hiding in anonymity and embracing her true identity. In the end, the choice had been easy. A Navy SEAL doesn't run from challenges or hide from opportunities to serve. Sarah Martinez had found her place in Millbrook not despite her military background, but because of it. And for the first time since Marcus's death, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. As they reached their front door, Sarah realized that sometimes the best way to protect your family is to be authentically yourself, using your gifts to make the world a safer and better place for everyone. The quiet woman at the park had been hiding her light under a bushel, but now that light was shining bright for her entire community to see. And that, she realized, was exactly how it should be.